Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another sermon here. We're going to be talking about Sabbats today. My name is Andrews, and I am the Hierophant of the Church of Witchcraft. And from that, I am basically somebody that keeps things on the rails and makes sure that things don't get too far off track, with a lot of help from many people. I also practice celestial witchcraft, basically a lot of astrology, celestial transits, that kind of thing. And that's what my general focus is for my witchcraft. I appreciate everybody who's here today being present. And also thanks to anybody who's watching this out on YouTube or whatever platform you happen to be watching on in the future. Okay, so we are working with Sabbats today, and we'll be looking at those. Last sermon, last month, we talked about Esbats, and those are just the full moon celebrations, basically. And I don't mean this in a hierarchical sense, it's more of just that it's the fact of how we interact, but the Esbats are a lesser celebration versus the Sabbats, which are a greater celebration. So Sabbats are essentially prominent sacred witchcraft days. It's the easiest way that I can phrase that. It's not necessarily holy. It might be, depending on what your deity is, but they're those kinds of days. They may also be referenced as major festivals. They could be cross-quarter days, and those are specific things, but you will also hear that sometimes they will be referenced as that. And also you might hear these as power days. In my own preference, I tend not to relate anything too much to power if I can help it, and I'm focused more on potency or efficacy versus power. There's a certain dynamic that's set up with that I do tend to stay away from, just in my own personal. If you want to use power days, go for it, because it is synonymous with what you are doing on those days. So where did this word come from? Sabbat is an odd word because we're familiar with it, or we have heard it in things like the Sabbath, for example. And the Sabbath itself we also have several animals around here that just love to go up and down stairs. So the Sabbaths are things that we see in Abrahamic religions, and it's a day of rest. And a day of rest is usually on Sundays. It's in the Bible. You can look it up. I don't need to go too far down that road, but Sabbath is that word. So it may seem odd that we're using the word Sabbath in witchcraft, just as it may seem odd that we're using the word Church of Witchcraft, but those have specific meanings, and we're kind of reclaiming some of those and demystifying some of them and decolonizing those to a certain degree as well. Where this word comes from, we're just going to go a little bit reverse in history, that the Greek word Sabbaton is the word they used, and it generally meant rest. And then it was also further back from Hebrew, Shabbat, or all of those things meaning rest. And also feel free to chime in at any point in time during this conversation. I would much rather, talk and have a conversation rather than me just lecture. So if things come up, you can just figure out how to raise your hand on Zoom, and I'll be able to call on you on that, or I will just continue on this tirade. Sabbats are not actually frequently used, even in terms of witchcraft. We don't see that until relatively contemporary era, and like you'll see some references to it in the 16th, 17th centuries, but very few and far between, scattered usages. And we're talking 1 to 3 mentions in a book, or in trials. It's very rarely even heard then. We start seeing a higher frequency usage of the word Sabbat when we get up into the 20th century, when we start seeing, and even 19th, 20th century around there. And that had to do with witchcraft trials and that kind of thing. There is also, Sabbats have been known to be sometimes defined as a rendezvous of witches to worship the devil, which I have some challenges with just in general, because it's assuming that there's even a devil to even talk about in witchcraft in that of itself. So you have to ascribe that the Abrahamic anything exists and that you're following that or respecting it. But in a lot of Sabbatic sort of witchcraft and ceremonial stuff, you'll see an inversion. So you'll see things like, think about the Satanic Bible, for example. So the Satanic Bible had the Black Mass and had inversions of what, or corruptions of the standard Abrahamic sort of concepts and festivals and ceremonies, and they would just invert them. I suspect that the Sabbat being titled a rendezvous of witches to worship the devil is about that same inversion, where a day of rest is the Sabbat supposed to be. Witches are busy having a wild party with feasts and sex and all of that stuff, which would just be an inversion of a day of rest. And I can see that connection sort of coming through, and I theorize that that's why Sabbat was used that way, because it was considered the reverse of something, the opposite or the negative of that, just like witches at that time period would be considered to be expressing as that negative or baneful side, the malefic side. The Witch of Sabbat is also a painting that you can find. It's a Renaissance painting. You'll find several different paintings that say the Witch of Sabbat, and it's depicting witches at a Sabbat worshiping the devil and doing all that partying stuff. But again, that term is pretty rare. Even in historic terms, you don't see that very frequently. Increased Mathers of the witchcraft trials, like all that stuff, basically never used that word, just didn't exist. So I find it fascinating that we've kind of arrived at this point with Sabbat, and we'll find out kind of how that happened and where that originated from and how it sort of came into common nomenclature. Essentially, the word Sabbat now, or at least in contemporary use and neo-pagan use, and when I say neo-pagan, I'm meaning anything from really the 19th century mystery stuff all the way through to present day. It's a broad term to be understood as a sacred witchcraft day. That's how the Church of Witchcraft uses it. This is how most people reference it. This is how most people understand Sabbats in general. These are really important days that we're going to be doing something on. So it's widely used in the mission that we have for the church of revitalizing witchcraft under a flexible common practice. Having a common narrative that's consistent helps us have that conversation, so we know what we're talking about, so that we have some idea of where we're going. Otherwise, we're just talking nonsense to each other and we don't have any idea what's happening. But again, widely used, and it's very common in neo-paganism. So furthering that, we're going to delve some more into what Sabbats are and what they have at their core. These are days that are betwixt our world and the other world, very commonly. Not all of them, but many of the times it means that the other world or the chthonic or the underworld are all accessible, essentially, at these times. You have heard, of course, I'm sure that you've heard of the Samhain having the thinning of the veil. Thinning of the veil can be considered at different times as well, right? So if we have one at Samhain, 6 months later, you should have another thinning of the veil at the same time, right? And so thinning of the veil is not something that I generally talk about. Or use in my common practice. I won't generally talk about thinning of the veil. I'll mention it. It's relevant. People do mention it over time. But this connection to the other world is where we want to connect our world to that realm, basically. And we're finding a way to connect that, and we may be doing rituals or things of that nature around that specific thing. Often, Sabbats are related to celestial transits and or major events. So things like the solstice and equinox, right? So the way that the Earth moves around. And I have a helpful picture for this whenever I end up actually getting to it. This one. So this has to do with the Earth seasons. I think you guys can see that image now. Cool. So we have 2 equinoxes, 2 solstices, right? Some people will reference these and check me on this one too, but cross-quarter days may be the time in between those, or the cross-quarter days may be considered these. It depends on what system or tradition you're working from. But this gives us an easy way to understand what we mean when we say equinox. So you can see that the Earth is facing in a certain direction in March, that things are getting warmer, of course, as you get into, where's Litha here? We start seeing some of the darkening as well. And we see more of that darkening that's going on here. And then we start seeing during December, you're seeing it starting to lighten again. So we see this consistent cycle. Very much so. You will see this same cycle recognized across cultures for many different societies, cultures, and anthropological sources. You'll find that the equinoxes and solstices have specific important meaning. They're often tied, of course, to seasonal changes, and those seasonal changes then bring, of course, agrarian changes or things that have to do with the harvest. And so this is why these become really important. So with that, they commonly follow this agrarian sort of track. A lot of the Sabbats do. So the wheel of the year is a common word that we'll hear, or a common phrase, and it's pervasive throughout all of witchcraft, especially today. We'll hear wheel of the year all the time, but it's not necessarily applicable, and it doesn't actually have a really strong basis. The lore that I was able to find from the Church and School of Wicca's stuff, from other related groups, from other books that I was reading, I'll go through those in a minute. They all weren't able to canonically establish this connection of how the Wheel of the Year began or when it happened, and there's stories all over the place. So just consider this current mythos is an easy understanding of that. So the Wheel of the Year is purportedly connected to Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner. Ross Nichols was related to founding the Druids, so OBOD, and I'm not even going to try to remember what that acronym is, but you can look that up. Basically, he's the founding person of that and had specific Celtic Sabbats or important holy days that they observed. In connection to Gerald Gardner, the legend goes that Gerald Gardner brought in the solstice and equinox component, and then they put those two things together. When, where, how, why, with who, at what point, all varies depending on who's telling the story. Which coven, which group, all varies. I think there's a pretty good amount of, I think there's some credence to this, because I do see that this is how these two things kind of got conjoined. And they have become what is the standard Wheel of the Year that we see now. So it's a conglomeration of several different cultures, basically. All of the Wheel of the Year names that you're going to hear in just a minute, all of those may have alternative names. So, and it depends on what culture you're talking about, whether it's Germanic or Gaulish, or if it has to do with Irish, Scottish, or if it's even Aboriginal, for example. You're going to see different names for this. So it's not necessarily the exact name, and it's not one thing. It's several different ways that you can consider this. You'll also see many of these festivals will tend to line up with other religions as well. And that's not necessarily witchcraft, but what witchcraft has been, at least in the way that we see it, is that witchcraft has to do with it being the toolbox that witches pull from. What tradition or system that you're working within is your determination or what have you. Many witches will share that same witchcraft of the Wheel of the Year, and there are some common parlance names that you'll hear pretty frequently, and they don't change. There's some challenge of historicity about their accuracy and whether or not they were actually called that. So do your research, but generally speaking, these ensuing names are going to be ones that most witches will be familiar with and most will be observing, or you will find consistent practice with. I'm just going to errantly start in Yule. A lot of witchcraft groups will see Yule as the beginning of the new year, and then moving forward, just pick where you need to be, depending on whatever your system or tradition is. It's just for reasons of organization. So in no order of importance, we start with Yule. And this is basically the shortest day and the longest night. And that is that time in December, usually around the 21st or so. And this is the winter solstice. And it's when the god is being brought into the world, basically. And we'll talk about some variations of that too, but we're going to reference this from goddess god perspective, and I'll talk about some of the variations after. So the goddess is birthing the god essentially from Wiccan consideration, because I'm going to reference this from a Wiccan perspective because of the origination point of the Wheel of the Year, to clarify. So during Yule, this is one of the times that we're bringing back into the world. There's a reincarnation. The cycle is beginning again. From there, we go into Imbolc, and this is the returning fire. This is the goddesses in recovery, and it's a time of initiations often for a lot of covens when a year and a day starts, and those kinds of things start to begin. And it's mostly for organization purposes, and it has to do with this sequence that's occurring. Yule is also, you'll see it is spelled Y-U-L-E. You also see it spelled J-U-L. which is a reference to the Norse, understanding of that. The Norse challenge, the Nordic faiths basically split their year into 2 cycles. They had summer months and they had winter months. And that is why we have Yule in the winter months. So there's a whole sequence that's going on. It's not just like one day, it's not 1 month, it's the whole series of time that's occurring. As far as I know, you might hear this, you might hear it as winter solstice, you might hear it as Yule, you might hear it as some of those things. So if you hear that, that's about when it's going to occur. This is also flip-flopped if you're talking about Southern Hemisphere versus Northern Hemisphere. It just is the way that the world turns. You can look it up. That's beyond the course of this discussion. After Imbolc, there's Ostara. That's classically when my coven does we have our annual tea party, and that's during Ostara. It's usually a very feast-heavy time, and we see a lot of feast throughout this. But Ostara is the spring equinox. It's a time for its true spring and signals when things are going to start coming back, when things are going to start growing again. Also with fertility, it has to do with balance, beginnings, as well as so that was a time of balance. I have a lot of connection to Ostara because of the way that I practice. So because it's more celestial in nature, I have the equinox solstice, and this is one of those important ones, and that's why the spring equinox is important to me. After that, we go into, and that's right around March 20th, 21st-ish, depending. There's a series of days. It depends on when it lands. It just has to do with the rotation of Earth. Again, you can look that up otherwise. After that, we go into, you'll mostly hear this called Beltane. Yes, there's an alternative name for that, which is Beltane. It depends on which way that how you were initiated into witchcraft, basically. If you're observing the Sabbats, you might hear this one of 2 ways. Most frequently, you'll hear it as Beltane. And this is where the god has come into his manhood. So this is the evolution of the man as the god is increasing in virility. So this is more fertility, vitality, passion, and hope, and there's a unification that's going on at this point. After that, and that's generally on May 1st. Yes, Monty.
Yeah, I just had a quick question because both Ostara and Beltane are associated with fertility. Is one of them feminine fertility and then the other masculine fertility, or is there any connection there?
I think you can make a strong case for that. I would say that there's more feminine fertility of things coming into fruition when you're talking about Ostara, that things are being seeded, whereas you're seeing a conjoining of god goddess at Beltane. So there's a combination that's occurring that didn't occur in Ostara, both fertility, but different aspects of that same process.
Well, and like the symbol of the maypole is traditionally like a phallic symbol. Mm-hmm. So that's another argument to Beltane being like a male typical, I guess, fertility holiday Sabbat.
It is more solar oriented. You will see the chalice, or you'll see a cauldron, which is the symbol of the feminine womb. So you're seeing both symbols of male and female duality that's happening during Beltane. If that helps clarify, Monty.
It does. Thank you.
Neat. Okay. From there we go to Litha, which you will also hear called Midsummer. Yes, that movie is applicable here, but frankly, Midsummer really only depicts a Beltane ritual, which I thought was weird because it's during June 21st. Litha is important to me, and I have more of a connection to it. This is our time for, I always have to go through my head. Solstice, summer solstice, brain cannot function. Mm-hmm. Summer solstice, Midsummer, Litha. This is potency at its zenith. So this is when the consummation has occurred, and this has all the potency that you could possibly want. So there's a lot of magic that is done here, and there's a lot of that sort of creation that's going on during that time. It's the height of the goddess and the god. It's at their most efficacious. It also has to do with purification, as well as health, love, and doing larger magical workings. This depends, though, because not every tradition or system thinks that you should be doing spells or magic during a Sabbat, that it's where we're honoring the god and goddess, or we're honoring some sort of aspect, some dualism that's occurring, versus doing our own magic. Varies. For me, I will 100% do spell working and witchcraft on Sabbats. Personal choice. Follow your tradition as you see fit. After Litha, we reach to Lughnasadh, which, haha, it's coming up really soon, which will totally date this video of when this was done. But August 1st is usually the archetypical spot for Lughnasadh.
If you're in the northern hemisphere.
Right. If you're in the northern hemisphere, just reverse this if you're in the southern hemisphere.
It'd be February 1st.
Right. It is also the sign of the first harvest. So this begins I'll just call it the triptych of harvest festivals, basically, that are occurring. Lughnasadh signals when the god begins to wane. So now we're losing that potency and efficacy, that virility that we saw through the spring aspect. So we had Ostara, Beltane, Litha, that being that strong potency of the solar stuff, as we're moving into a more reposed, kind of relaxed state of the god. So think about all the things that have to do with harvests at that time. So all of the getting tools ready, making sure all of the meat product, all of the livestock is accounted for, all of the grain, all the berries, all that gathering stuff is happening. So we wouldn't be doing that during Litha. And you're starting to pick up on this agrarian component. This is why I said that the Wheel of the Year is very agrarian in nature. So it's following a lot of farming practices and that sort of thing, because of course, as the Earth has more sun or less sun, seasons change. And then this was picked up on and noticed, and this is where a lot of that mythos comes in. After Lughnasadh is the autumn equinox, or Mabon. Mabon is another way you might hear that. This one, that name specifically, is in contention. So I think that Imbolc might be as well. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's a couple of names within the Wheel of the Year that they weren't sure if they were historic, had any historic basis. Mabon is definitely one of those that we're not sure if that name or that title has historic significance or basis. Suffice to say, this is our autumn equinox. So this is signaling the completion of your harvest. So this is, you've gotten all the things, all the grain silos are stored, all the meat is starting, we're doing all of those pieces. You're getting ready for winter. There's a lot of sharing, and there's different principles and traditions that go along with all of these. After that, we go to one of the witches' favorite, or at least contemporary witches, is Samhain. Samhain. For those who are not aware, it is Samhain, not Samhain. It is not Samhain either. I've also heard some other fascinating ways to describe that. This is the last of the harvest festivals. So those three, that triptych that I was just talking about, has to do with Lughnasadh, Mabon, and Samhain. And they're different aspects of when what harvest is happening, right? We begin the harvest on Lughnasadh, August 1st. Then it goes into Mabon, where we're starting to finalize everything that we're doing, and then Samhain is the ending. And this is where we see a lot of that slaughter going on of livestock, the old livestock that's not going to make it through the winter, which is why we see a lot of sacrifices during that time. It's appeasing deities, it's appeasing entities. But during Samhain, we're seeing that, and it's also a time for ancestral worship. So Samhain, we're seeing a lot of sacrificing and that sort of thing. It's the last of the god. So the god is done at this point. So this is the death of the god entity that you're talking about. So after the god has, all the spring fertility stuff has happened, we have the death of the god at this point. So this has to do with our sacrifice, reflection. It has to do with our ancestors. So necromancy is one of those things. So death divination. So necromancy isn't just we're raising the dead, or we're not reanimating the dead necessarily. Mancy is related to divination, whereas urgy is related to a skill, but that's in a different sermon and does not apply to this directly. So I won't get too boogie boarded off of that. But yes, necromantic practices do exist during this time. Dumb suppers, that kind of thing, you'll see those in references to that. And that finishes up the whole and then we go from Samhain back to Yule, and then we start that whole cycle again. And so Yule was the time when the god is being birthed again from the consummation that happened during Beltane. So this is the sequence that we see from the Wheel of the Year. Purportedly, like I said, had to do with Gerald Gardner, connected to Ross Nichols, combining those two things. My personal practice, I'm not a farmer, And I've never farmed anything. I don't collect wheat or grain. So I don't do any of those things. So I don't recognize those in my own practice. I recognize them for others and I understand why they're doing that. But there's also a lack of duality in my practice as well. So I don't have necessarily a male-female aspect or a god-goddess aspect. And some of the variations you'll see too on this same kind of theme. So my Sabbats are generally considered just the solstice equinox sequence, and I'm focused on how that changes globally and how that augments my practice. That's a very specific celestial thing that I do, and that's why I don't necessarily, observe the other ones, or I don't have the same kind of import on those others. I will absolutely participate in them. They're just not ones that I necessarily plan for because they're not the big changes that I'm seeing or that I recognize in my practice or that fuel my practice. One thing I did not write down on this is that each one of these Sabbats has their own particular traditions that are occurring. It depends on what tradition you're in. It depends on who you're practicing with. You can do some of the solitary, some of it is a group only thing. The initiations thing is a different, so there are many different approaches and variations on all of these Sabbats and how they're recognized or how they're observed, or even if they're observed, or what their name is. You'll have to do your research. There's a ton of resources about that. The one that Gwen pointed out to me was this guy, Sabbats Almanac, and this is a pretty thick one, and this one will give you a lot of information more in depth about the Sabbats, the sequence, what days they're happening, some ideas on your ritual preparation and that aspect. So there's no one specific ideal thing that happens at these things, right? The tradition may change, the spells and rituals may change. All of these I would consider ceremonies as well. So all Sabbats are ceremonies. They contain rituals, so that's just a bunch of behaviors that we do at a certain time during a larger thing, and you may be doing spell work or divination during that time. Again, some traditions don't do any witchcraft during those. Again, refer to your system or tradition as you're exploring these things. I think that it's really helpful, though, for people to observe this and kind of get an idea of what that cycle feels like, because I did observe them for quite some time, pretty consistently, and it was informative to my witchcraft practice. So each one of them reflects the purpose of the Sabbat. So I wouldn't necessarily be contacting ancestors during Beltane, as one example. And I'm not necessarily going to be doing fertility rites during Samhain, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So there are correspondence that go along with each one of those. There you can find other correspondences, but try to put like with like and not mix those things up. So every Sabbat calls magic, and it may or may not, you may or may not be participating in that magic itself. So the purpose of our Sabbats. So now we know what they are, when they happen, generally what the idea behind the Wheel of the Year is, and some of the celebrations that are attached to it as well. The Sabbatic purpose, I suppose I would phrase that as, is that it's a dramatization for potential trance states. So the process of some of the variations like Holly King, Oak King, you may be dramatizing that or having that played out, right, as theater within a specific Sabbat. You may see the Horned One and the Goddess, for example. You may be seeing the dramatization or the playing out of that. And so there are dramatizations that you will do within those Sabbats that recall what the purpose of those Sabbats are. And this is part of participating in basically the cosmic theater. It's being a part of the cycle, recognizing the cycle, feeding into magic, and not just for self, but also for community reasons as well. And it's about recognizing how those things change. There's how the cycle moves in your own practice. And so it will vary from person to person, from practice to practice. All that is present for Esbats are also in Sabbats, so you will see that same ritualization behavior. You'll see those same, habit forming kind of things that are going on as well. in those. So everything that's happening in Esbot, you'll see recalled in the Sabbats themselves. And that has to do with things like your your sacred space development, invocation, whatever working you're going to be doing within that, if you're doing a working at all, a devocation, and releasing that sacred space. Sacred spaces come in a variety of different flavors. Could be a circle, could be calling quarters, varies tradition, system, depending on the system and tradition, as is with all of this. Intention setting is one of the really important pieces to this. So during your sabbats, or at least the way that I've observed them, is that I set my intention for that time. Like I said, putting like with like correspondences together, right? So I'm not necessarily going to be calling the ancestors during a spring rite. I'm not necessarily going to be doing a fertility rite during Yule, as an example. And that is part of my intention setting. So with that intention setting, it is something to do with metaphorical concepts. So if you have a consummation of the god goddess, it may be a consummation of a idea coming to fruition or coming to pass. If you're seeing the death of the god, for example, it might be the ending of a cycle or the ending of something. So think of them as metaphors and not necessarily as literal things. And that is what I mean by taking a correspondence and putting like with like. And then on those sabbats, you're following that basically mythos that's happening and setting your intentions for that specific time. It's also a time for first altar maintenance as well. So first altar is just the altar of self. It's where all of our magic comes from, stems from, is ourselves, right? And so that first altar maintenance is also done during that time. Drawing down entities, deities, the moon, however you want to do that, can replenish somebody as well as keep them on that equilibrium that they're experiencing in their life. When you lose that kind of sequence or that equilibrium, things get a little weird for people. They do really good with consistency and some structured framework, and you can't change the sun. It's going to be happening. So you can either, and it's a good thing to sort of set your pace by and give you some of this healthy, this death growth cycle that's going on in your life, and find how that influences your own practice, influences your life, and keep you present and aware instead of drifting and becoming unaware of your life and not really being present in what your experience is, and kind of getting into that kind of malaise or that depression that people get into, especially with people who have seasonal affective disorder or propensities for depression. Having this kind of consistency is really helpful, and the sun's not going to change no matter what you do. At least in our lifetimes, it's going to take at least another billion years to burn out. As far as I know, I won't be around here for the heat death of the universe. Yeah, it's the second time I've referenced the heat death of the universe. So
like you referenced it before, yes.
There's also a communal aspect of witchcraft that happens during these. Yes, you can do all of these sabbats by yourself. There's often a lot of solitary practitioners that are practicing. You might not have a coven or a group to practice with, but with that communal aspect, even if you are solitary, the rites that you're doing further magic, they further witchcraft, they encourage other people to do the same thing. I do my best to live my practice, or practice what I preach, which is actually literal now. But practicing what I preach is really important, because by my example, by other clergy's roles and their example, you see their consistency with their practice. You're seeing these cycles and rhythms that are going on, their dedication to this thing. And so you can do the same thing. It's not just us, it's everybody else too. So even if you're a solitary practitioner, the communal aspect is also important. Other witches may be inspired to follow what you're doing, or maybe you'll find other people. There are gatherings and groups, nature, earth churches, if you will, that may celebrate these too in your area. It just depends. But it does help me keep myself on track and grounded, if you will, on what my place is within that cosmic cycle. So during our sabbats, so TCW does recognize sabbats. Really, we want covens to be doing this, but in light of not having a lot of covens that are available that have a specific practice or don't practice consistently or just straight up don't exist, we've basically stepped in and filled in that role from the clergy side on ours. We respect all forms of modalities, and this is one thing that helps us observe the sabbats in this way. The sabbats that we have are always hosted by our clergy. These are the ordained members Deacons will generally have somebody overseeing them, but priest or higher usually is doing it, can do it by themselves. Basically, they can run the sabbats of their own accord. Because of this, the sabbat form that is expressed, so whatever it happens to be, so since I'm not doing Samhain as an example, somebody else might pick that up. And if somebody else is doing it, it's going to take the form of that person's witchcraft. It's not that we're endorsing one kind of sabbat, it's just that the way that it's expressed is by individual and by the clergy member themselves. And so we get a different flavor as we go across, and more people that are new to witchcraft see a variety of different sabbats in their practice, so that they may have more exposure to learn more and be encouraged to observe the sabbats in the way that they see fit. When I run sabbats, they're obviously more celestial in nature, so they have more to do with the solstice equinox components, and it will have more of that flavor to it. But again, it's about the exposure, it's about the awareness of that, it's about people being able to see a lot of different varieties instead of there just being one central dogmatic practice. They are roughly 3 to 4 hours in length. Generally, we consider them semi-formal or formal, where kind of idea that we should be bringing our best to the table, right? We're interacting with the other world, we're interacting with this important aspect, and what kind of perspective you want to bring to that, what kind of perspective you want to bring to your own practice, how do you want to observe that with others if you are practicing with others. It could be outdoors. Oftentimes it's outdoors, not every time it's in the same location. It could vary. It just depends on what the needs are, what clergy member is running it, what version of witchcraft they're working with, and how they're practicing. Again, the spots are highest order and of observed sacred times generally. So these are really important, so please do them. The ritual layout basics of this, like I was saying, have to do with the calling in a sacred space, doing our invocation, things that happen in the middle, whether that's spellcraft or divination, combination, some activity, and then a devocation, and then releasing of that sacred space. Mine is going to look a little bit different because of celestial. Other people might have it in pure Wiccan. They might follow Cochrane. It just depends on how they're doing that. An example of some of that spellcraft and divination for Mabon, for example, since I'll be running that. Mabon has, I use an apple hex for one of the activities that we're doing. I also have a new activity that I'm planning for this year too. And this is also working with that ancestral side, that internal side. So some of these activities, like I said, some tradition systems have no interest in doing any sort of magical practice during that time. But I think that it's a really important time to focus on your craft, even if you're not doing spells or doing divination of any kind. Making sure that you're observing your own craft, observing these cycles is really important. Whatever name you call them, whatever entity or deity that you're working with is yours to reference. We also will support any claims for time off or religious freedoms and that sort of thing. We want to support that. So if you have an employer or if you're concerned with taking those things off and not being taken seriously, just have your employer email or call us, because we will totally vouch for you. It's important that there is an organization that can at least go to bat and back up your claims. Generally, that won't be necessary, but it may become necessary, and that's part of the reason that the Church of Witchcraft exists in the first place. So again, employers can call or email us if that's necessary. And also, I personally don't work on any of the important sabbats to me. So solstice equinox, I'm always off work. And really, it's just me giving the notification I'm not going to be present. It's not really even a request at that point. That's a very specific to me thing. I would like everybody else to be doing that. But again, leading by example as best as I can. Sometimes that's just not even reasonable. Circumstances may not allow for that in that instance. If you can't take off every spot, because imagine always requesting 8 days off a year, it gets a lot, especially when you get into the harvest festivals where you're taking off a day all 3 of those months, and especially with some of the stigma when people are like, if you take off October 31st for Samhain as an example, taking that off may out you as a witch, and if you don't want to talk about it or are not open about it, it may cause some of those problems, or it may just be denied because some employers don't think that Samhain belongs in witchcraft and that it's just a fun holiday and are trying to get out of things. Some cases that might be true, but it's still the religious practice, and we still support that. And that's, again, one of the things that we can facilitate. So if you can't take every one of those, pick one or two that are the most important to you. Try to get at least two. Usually I would recommend picking something at the solar side or the lunar side, or the waxing side or the waning side. So pick two of those and at least observe that. And if you can't follow those specific days, just pick a day in a waxing period or a waning period. So the first 6 months or the last 6 months of the year, depending on your hemisphere, just choose a day, and whatever that day is, just be consistent. Know why you're doing it and what the observation is for. I strongly encourage taking time off for these things. Observing your practice is really important, and not enough witches actively do that, as far as I'm aware. I think some are. I think that the times are becoming easier for us to be able to take that time off and to actually have that validity to it. Certainly the Church and School of Wicca is a recognized protected religion, and it's really easy to point to that. And that's made a lot of inroads and strides for our own practice and our own observations. But to continue that, to keep that active, it has to be utilized. And if we're not utilizing it, it's just going to go away. And so if we're not taking that time, taking those observation days, it weakens our own claim to those things. Maybe not for ourselves, maybe not for the community, but certainly within the greater community, right? And that is in terms of legality and that sort of thing. If they're like, if you're not observing any of these, you're not really doing anything. This isn't really a thing. And so if we aren't taking those days, it's sort of I take it as a responsibility to take that time, because it needs to be used. That time needs to be observed. And if we're not observing those things, then how can we make a claim that we're actually observing any sort of religious aspect, or even not even religious, but even philosophical aspect? So take those days off that you need to. Adjust your life as you need to for that. Adjust your celebrations as you can. At the very least, on each one of those days, if you can't take that time off, plan at least an hour in the evening, even half an hour, something. Just getting into that same consistency and that same practice is going to go a long ways for you. So variations on the theme. With all of that said, we now have an idea of why Sabbats matter. Sabbats are ceremonies, and inside are contained rituals. Sabbats are also rituals, and there's similar practices between both of these things. The Sabbats are going to have a more global impact. And so variations on this. Witches aren't just Wiccan. So all Wiccans are witches. Not all witches are Wiccan. What this means specifically, there's a really good description of this also between Gerald Gardner's fertility religion, Wicca, and then you have I think it's Robert Cochrane, but basically Cochranism staunchly opposed to that, vehemently and openly said that Gardner was out of his mind, and basically said that Cochrane didn't even want what he was observing to even be considered religion. It sort of accidentally became that just because of practitioners and that sort of thing over time. But Cochranism, I don't really see any of these Sabbats that are in there either, because it's not related to the same Wheel of the Year that came out of Wicca, because Cochranism is not Wicca. They're two very different things. And that also kind of goes so Cochranism is a mystery tradition. So it has to be a certain thing that's uniquely experienced by the individual. And it's not something that can necessarily be taught. It has to be experienced, ergo mystery tradition, because what is the mystery? Whatever it is to you, right? And it's not even religious observation. So this mystery traditions like Cochranism won't have these kinds of Sabbats. They just chucked out the whole fertility thing in the first place, and they went with the goddess and the horned god. So that's not even, the fertility isn't even a part of that. Cochrane's original group was Tubal Cain, I believe. I don't remember the full name of that. And it has had various iterations into present day. But certainly it wasn't supposed to be considered a religion, and it doesn't have the Sabbats that Gardner has. And they may have specific holy days, but they aren't necessarily going to follow Sabbats. you'll see this specifically with things like Kabbalah. There may be specific days of the week that are auspicious, but not necessarily overt, certain segments of the year that are being observed. They're picking a Monday or Tuesday for a certain operation with a certain sequence of things to reveal the inner mysteries, basically. And so that mystery tradition aspect won't necessarily have the Sabbat. So Sabbats tend to be one of those aspects that is really endemic to Wicca itself. But I think it's a really good spot for witches to sort of begin with their practice and start exploring some of these different expressions and ideas behind what the Wheel of the Year is, why it matters, and you'll still get something out of it, because just like the mystery traditions, you have to do it and experience it on your own. And that's one of those avenues to experience mysteries of some kind. There are orthopraxic traditions that have to do with the behavior, but not necessarily the deity or the entity or the religious aspect, that they dictate how you do things, but not necessarily what you do it with. And that also may not have sabbats within it too. Oath-bound traditions are just as they are, oath-bound, which means that if you're not in the in-group, you aren't going to know what their practices are, and it could be any range of things. It could be the Wheel of the Year, it could be something else entirely. Individual practitioners, solitary practitioners, may also have their own specific special holy days that exist. Initiation days may become one of those important celebrated days and have nothing to do with the Wheel of the Year at all. Like for me, the solstice and equinox times are the more important. They just are part of the Wheel of the Year. With that said, the others I just don't observe because it's not relevant to my practice. So you can determine how you want to do this and how you want to express your witchcraft in the way that you want to. If you're part of a group or coven, if you're not a solitary practitioner of some kind, then you'd be following whatever it is they're doing. But definitely ask questions about it. Consider, why is it important to you, and does it have relevance to you? And if it doesn't, you may want to choose new options. If we move away from just Eurocentric sort of, so the Euro-Western sort of esotericism with the mystery traditions, oath-bound, orthopraxic stuff, if we go into Mesopotamia, specifically in Babylonian stuff, they don't observe these things. They're more related to solstice equinox, but they're also more about their patron deities. And they have, I don't remember what the name is off the top of my head, but there's a 12-day sequence that they're observing, and it has to do with their patron deity. They will also have, in that society, they worship things like military conquest, victories, leaders or rulers that came into power. And those were the important holy or sacred days versus just the Wheel of the Year. So the Wheel of the Year is not the only way to celebrate your magic. It's not the only special or important or auspicious days that exist. It is a good format. It's a great substrate, and adapt it as you need to, because it's in that of itself. The Wheel of the Year was adapted. It was a conglomeration of several different sources, of several different cultures, for a very solid reason. And that's why there's so many different names for each one of these, because they're observed across the world at different times and for different purposes. Another variation you might hear is the Holly and Oak Kings, the Oak King being the waxing time of the year and the Holly King being the waning time of the year. And this, I think, echoes some of that Germanic ideation, or that Nordic sort of faith, where they're basically, we have summer months and we have winter months, and there's stuff that happens in between those times, right? And so they're very dual in that nature, and that Holly King and Oak King aspect, I think, echoes some of that conceptually, that we're seeing, a waxing time of the year and a waning time of the year. There's always going to be duality in most of these traditions, as far as I have been able to discern. And so you'll see that duality echoed throughout. That ends most of the stuff I have for Sabbats, but celebrate those as you see fit. Be curious about those. There's a lot of resources out there, but they're certainly not the only auspicious, holy, or sacred times. And they may only be relevant to you, especially if you're a solitary practitioner, or if your coven worships or practices in a certain way. With that, does anybody have any questions about that?
I had a question about if there's a general format that Sabbats tend to share across traditions, or if they are all very different in the way that they're celebrated.
They are very different in their expression. It really depends on the system or tradition that's involved. What has become the most consistent has really stemmed from British traditional witchcraft, and that's all the Alexandrian, Cochrane, Gardner, Dianic, all that stuff tends to influence how Sabbats are seen. But again, Sabbats weren't even really a thing until the roughly, arguably 19th, but definitely in the 20th century. So they weren't even really around. So it's a contemporary notion. So because of that, I don't think there's one specific way to observe a specific Sabbat, and there's not necessarily a singular format. I have a specific format that seems to be pretty consistent across most people, and that was that ritual layout that I was talking about with the setting a sacred space, invoking whatever deity you're working with, the activities and then sandwiched in between that with a devocation, which is the parting of your deities or entities, whatever you're working with, and then a releasing of the sacred space. Seems to be the most consistent ritual-wise. We can get really fine-grained on each one of those things and why we do them and how and from who, but those seem to be the broadest strokes that I've been able to discern that is consistent across most systems and traditions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end our recording, but thank you again for everybody who was here, who was able to listen, who's tuning in later to watch this. If you have any questions, you can always email or call the Church of Witchcraft. We're also available on Discord for any of these discussions, and we have a specific Sabbat channel within our Discord, and that is the place where we can talk about some of our ideas, about what activities we want to do, what deities may be existing within that practice or within that observation. And organizing some of those things as well. We also have we have a program for mentorship if you want one-on-one practice with this, called our Embers program. So feel free to reach out to the church with any of that information, and please feel free to get connected with us on any of these platforms, and we would love to see people in the future. And we will see you at one of those future Sabbats or one of the Asbats. But that gives us a better idea of some of our general practice within the Church of Witchcraft, what it's expressed as, how we observe it, and some of where it comes from as well. So again, thank you so much for this evening, and we'll see you probably next month for the next sermon. Have a great evening.